So we've seen good examples and we've seen bad examples of government intervention with urban logistics. A very bad example, for instance, is what we see in a lot of cities in Latin America, for example, where they impose access restrictions for commercial vehicles solely based on the type of vehicle or sometimes even just the license plate number of the vehicle. And the idea is, well, that the city observed that there are too many commercial vehicles on the road. So the very fast solution was, well, let's restrict the access of those vehicles to the city. But actually, I mean, as I mentioned in the beginning, you need to get the goods into the cities to enable the social life, but also the economic life of those cities. So just banning vehicles from accessing the cities doesn't really solve the problem. And what we see in those cities is that actually those restrictions lead to an increase of the amount of vehicles because companies are smart. If they can no longer access an area with a big vehicle, they just access it with two smaller vehicles. And that doesn't necessarily improve the traffic or the emission situation. And that's where people in the city, in governments or where legislators and policymakers need to become smarter, need to talk more with the private sector, need to use data more stringently to come up with smart policy decisions that actually are, well, solve the problem but are also viable to operate on for the private sector. A good example, however, is, for instance, we used to work with the city of Santiago in Chile to improve the availability of freight-dedicated parking infrastructure. So cities can, through very simple measures like creating parking bays that are dedicated to freight vehicles, at least for some portions of the day, they can alleviate both the congestion problem of their city and improve the efficiency of last-mile delivery processes by investing in such relatively simple to implement measures. And again, the key challenge here is, for instance, finding out how many of those parking bays do you need, where should you locate them, and how should they be regulated. So during which time of the day should they be reserved to freight, for instance. And that's where data analytics comes into play, where people like us work with GPS traces of the key vendors in a certain area of a city to understand the freight demand of that part of the city and how the infrastructure should ideally be designed to accommodate that demand. So for instance, if we would see a carbon emission tax for cities, for instance, or any other way of basically financially penalizing kilometers or miles traveled within a city by commercial vehicles, I don't think that this would influence consumer behavior. You and I, we are used to ordering on Amazon or the like and getting our good the next day or the same day, and it's unlikely that customer expectations will revert in the future just because delivery became more costly. So the key effect of a carbon emissions tax, for instance, would be on the cost model of the logistics service provider or of the delivery provider. And basically that would just urge those companies to be even smarter in the way they deliver to the customers, to be even more efficient in the way they route their vehicles. Probably it will incentivize them to change their choice of vehicle type. It might incentivize the use of electric vehicles, for instance, which are currently probably still less cost efficient than an internal combustion engine vehicle. But with the imposition of a carbon emission tax, that might change. And that's probably a policy measure that might be much more meaningful and much more effective than a hard restriction of access to certain kinds of vehicles, because you don't force companies to use one vehicle type or the other. You just incentivize them to use the vehicle type that you would favor. And that usually creates the better results. I do see a lot of potential in smart city solutions to improve last mile logistics. To give a very simple example, companies like GE and others, Siemens and others, are working on smart lighting, smart street lighting. That means you have not only a street light, but basically a street light that is equipped with various sensors that could, for instance, detect where a free parking space is along the street. If you could connect that data and make it available to logistics service providers, that would very much streamline their problem of finding appropriate parking spaces for their vehicles, finding spaces that are appropriate for their unloading and loading operations. That would reduce the amount of double parking that we see, for instance, nowadays. And so it would serve again two purposes. It would improve the traffic and congestion situation and streamline the delivery process to make it more cost efficient. So this is just one example of how a street infrastructure or smart city infrastructure could improve the last mile logistics situation for various different stakeholders. Well, we do see a lot of startup activity in the domain of last mile logistics actually. Even I know of 2 MIT startups, so startups founded by MIT students and MIT graduates that just tackle, for instance, the problem of smart routing. So if you know that you're operating in a highly uncertain environment like a city, how do you develop a routing algorithm that dynamically redesigns the route based on current information? So if throughout your delivery route you get new information on congestion patterns, how can you dynamically adjust your route sequence to mitigate that effect on your performance, basically? And so we see a lot of those data-driven, analytics-driven startups emerging, and we see a lot of response also from industry, because typically industry has considered last mile delivery as a very static problem. And now that we see increasing urbanization, we see increasing problems of congestion, we see increasingly dynamic customer requests, industry sees a need for smarter software solutions. And that's where I think a huge window of opportunity has opened and is probably further opening for startups to fill an interesting market gap.